Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to see this beautiful theater filled with so many students and community leaders and activists. And what an honor it is to have been invited by Scripps Presents to lead such a prolific discussion with a hero to so many, an icon political voice of the 20th and 21st century, a controversial voice, for sure, but a disruptor. And it is an honor to have you here, and I know you flew in from New York to be here. And thank you very much. I look forward very much to this discussion.
You're welcome.
The documentary title of your career and your life is The Unreasonable Man. And it's taken from a George Bernard Shaw quote, which says, in essence, the reasonable man wants to adapt to the world as it is. The unreasonable man persists in making the world adapt to himself. Was that a right title for your documentary and your life? Are you an unreasonable man?
No, but it's a nice, way to get people to look at the documentary. Because I proceed with reason and fact simply because that's the way you unify social mores and standards, because people like to connect to reality. That's fact. Reason allows us to draw conclusions and see what the consequences are of our behavior.
But let's just go back to the quote for a second, because it said, you will not adapt to the establishment. You are not adapting to the parties and the politics of the day or of the days of your ascent. You created your own desire for a more just and fair politic, and so you went in to be a disruptor. So you are a
Wait a minute, you're sugarcoating these situations. It's not disrupting or not adapting to parties or establishment. It's not adapting to cruelty, to greed, to oppression, to repression, to the lack of choice. If they happen to be called the Democratic and Republican Party or Wall Street or ExxonMobil, so be it. What unifies us is deep in our souls, we have a sense of fair play. We know what injustice is. And we've got to articulate it, because you can't have a sense of justice without a sense of injustice. Just think about that. If you do not grow up to have a factual base for injustice, you will not be able to advance justice. And our educational system is not up to it, including our law schools are not up to that precept, to the level that is necessary to keep elevating this tormented world of ours from its slide into the ground.
So you have called for a very long time, although you've been members of both parties and most parties, until you created your own third-party candidacy. You have called our two-party system for a long time a plutocracy overrun by greed, by corporatists, by Wall Street. Now, as we look back at your decades of championing our consumer rights, our civic rights, with the Trump presidency, are you seeing everything you have fought for blow up in one election?
Well, I didn't think it was going to happen that fast, but in 1 month he has demonstrated, camouflaged by his braggadocio, his personal attacks, his falsifications. Those are distractions. The playbook is becoming clear, and that is to bring into control of our government more than any time in our history the forces of big business, militarism, and racism. And you can see it with his nominations. It's in your face, American people. He wanted to put an anti-labor person in charge as Secretary of Labor. He's got an anti-public school billionaire in charge of the Department of Education. He has a former member of Congress in charge of Health and Human Services that wants to dismantle Obamacare and not replace it with full Medicare for everybody, which is a majority position in this country, and wants to corporatize Medicare, Medicaid, and get rid of the law of torts for incompetent health care or medical malpractice. He's got in other positions.
EPA, Scott Pruitt, against to sue the EPA.
Yeah, I mean,
14
here's
times.
a man who sued EPA not just for procedural irregularities. He didn't want the mission. He's now in charge of EPA.
He doesn't believe the science behind climate change.
He doesn't believe anything about giving you the right to breathe clean air, clean water, safe food, and revel in nature as it's meant to be properly used for future generations. The guy's an ignoramus, and he is in charge. And so you have...
So when you have...
And let's not forget about the empire. Let's not forget about militarism. The verdict isn't in yet about the generals. They are smart. They may restrain some of his provocations and his easily bruised ego from people overseas who might criticize him, but they seem to want to pick a fight with Russia and Iran, and they seem to want to pivot to Asia. All these are new formulations of old empire, and so we have the ultimate showdown between our democratic society and the people of this country, and I'm talking left-right opposition to a lot of things that he's pushing. Conservative families want safe, clean air and water. They want decent schools. They want decent public transit. They want to be fairly treated in the marketplace. They bleed like liberal families. And I think this is a major showdown. There's no more pretense. There's no more camouflage. Big business, Washington has come to rule, Wall Street has come to rule Washington. Well, so this is our opportunity to see what our metal is made of.
So you see this as an opportunity, not as a total and unequivocal meltdown?
No, I think if we don't have a major terrorist attack, which can blot out everything and produce, in effect, a dictator and great contracts and stifling dissent, everything that happened after 9/11 was extremely antagonistic to our civil liberties and our civil rights and our freedom of speech, and just made things worse by the overreaction to 9/11 overseas. Look at the metastasizing of all these attacking groups around these countries. Short of that, I'm putting my bet on the people of this country who in just 1 month have shown that they're not going to take it. They're not going to take it.
I want to continue on some of his choices just to get your take. Rex Tillerson, Exxon chief, now Secretary of State. How dangerous is this to have him in this position?
Well, presumptively, it's not a good recruiting device to have the head of diplomacy for our foreign policy come from a rapacious, polluting, gouging, arrogant, politician paying off oil company. It's just, there are better sources of talent, right? But sometimes people change in office. Sometimes they rise to a higher level of their own significance than just making tons of money. In contrast to Trump, he's got to be seen prima facie as a restraining hand because he's been all over the world. He's dealt with heads of state. But everything is very unpredictable coming down the pike.
We had a student from Scripps from the paper interview you just before we came out here, and one of the questions she asked you is that you predicted the impeachment very quickly, the fastest impeachment of a president in our history. And what did you say to her?
I said the impeachment offense is coming in early. He is maintaining ownership of vast businesses around the world, and our founding fathers basically were very fearful that if a president has all these assets and can be enriched to curry the president's favor by foreign interests or domestic businesses, that should be an impeachable offense. They're very clear about it.
So you do not think, Mr. Nader, that these implications with this Russian scandal are his undoing? You believe that the conflicts of interest with his businesses as president will be his ultimate failing?
Well, that could involve his dealings with the Russians, which is why he doesn't want to, I think, reveal his tax returns, which are this big, and they're full of all kinds of partnerships and deals, hugely revelatory. And that could be one reason why he doesn't want them disclosed.
When we talk about all these things, there's more and more doubt being cast on what we're hearing because of his waging war on the freedom of speech and the media, which you've had your controversies with and your great criticisms against. But this has taken it to a ratcheted up level where we have fake news, alternative facts, and where the president is now controlling or attempting to censor and control the narrative. How dangerous, particularly when in all of your books you say, we all own the airwaves and we don't exercise that power?
Yeah, we don't have our own audience network. We don't have our own radio and TV stations. We own the public airwaves. The broadcast business controls it 24 hours a day, compliments of a supine Congress and Federal Communications Commission. And we're the landlords. They're the tenants. They pay us no rent and they decide who says what 24 hours a day. Aren't you entitled to be outraged? Have you ever watched Saturday network TV? Hold on to your stomach, folks. That's how they're misusing your own property. That's one reason all the wonderful things you do in this country don't get heard, don't get reported, don't get voice. And so I think Donald Trump did one redeeming thing contrary to his practice of fabrications and falsifications, is that he fired, in effect, he demanded the resignation of his national security aide for lying. For lying.
Which you found to be quite ironic in one of your recent radio podcasts.
Pretty astonishing.
So again, this waging war on the media, our First Amendment, when we can't even trust what is coming out of the White House and that pulpit, how dangerous is this for one of the greatest pillars, the fourth estate of our democracy?
Well, obviously, it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance among people. They don't know who to trust, who to understand, who to read, who to believe. It's always been the case, but Trump has taken it to a new level of steroids. And however, it didn't start with Trump, it started with Madison Avenue decades ago. They lied always about advertising again and again, what certain medicines were able to do, what certain foods were able to do or not do to you, credit, banking, insurance. Falsification was part of puffery, it's called, in Madison Avenue. But now we, the people, are complicit because by anonymous commentary, we have no controls on our own factual accountability, do we? On Facebook and all the rest of it. And so we have to look at ourselves in the mirror. By the way, I think we always should look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves the question, do we spend more time looking at ourselves in the mirror than we spend looking over Congress?
You have blamed the media for really enabling this Trump presidency forward. And one of the quotes that I know that you repeat, and I have as well, is CBS Chief Les Moonves saying, it may not be good for America, but it's great for CBS. The money keeps pouring in. Keep on going, Donald. You have talked about this level of consumerism, commercialism, where there should be commercial-free zones, certainly in the electoral process and the campaign process on the airwaves. Has this just been, is this so inflated now, beyond what you even thought possible?
No, I think it's worse than ever. All the things we did in the 60s and 70s to get through Congress, Environment, Consumer, Worker Safety, Free Information Act, you couldn't even get a hearing today in Congress. That's how far gone we have allowed our hired hands to run away with our democracy and to run away with our attending to our necessities. Remember, if we have low expectation levels of our politicians, they'll oblige us, won't they? And the lower expectation levels we have, the more we're going to be controlled. And this young generation has very low expectation levels of political and legal systems and electoral systems. And may I tell the story of Eugene Debs?
Please.
The great labor leader that you study in your history, Eugene Debs. How many of you have heard of Eugene Debs? At the end of his career in the 1920s, he was worn out. He'd spoken to hundreds of thousands of people in open fields. He'd formed unions. He ran for president after Woodrow Wilson put him in jail for just speaking against World War I. He got 1 million votes. Great man. At the end of his career, a reporter came up to him and said, "Mr. Debs, what's your greatest regret?" And he looked at the reporter and he said, my greatest regret is that the American people, under the Constitution, can have almost anything they want, but it just happens that they don't seem to want much of anything at all. Now fast forward to post-World War II Europe, devastated, city, towns blown up, huge unemployment. And they had a strong labor movement, a strong cooperative movement. They have a multi-party system. And for 60 years, this is what they got for all their people, which we still do not have today in this country. For all their people, full health insurance, paid 4 to 7 weeks vacation, stronger labor law organizing, better public transit, tuition-free higher education, better pensions, and higher pay for the lower one-third working class in those countries, to name a few. What's our excuse? We allowed ourselves to be manipulated so that we thought the only thing we should get out of our working life is salary and wages, stuck at a low minimum wage, and not a high return for our taxes. But in Europe, they got more for their taxes. They got tuition-free education. They got universal health care. They got decent parks. They got support for the arts. They got better public transit. See what expectation levels? That's what we ought to self-analyze ourselves. Why are expectation levels so low when we allow corporate power to shoot their expectations to the sky in terms of their enriching themselves and stripping their own shareholders of any voice, a major contradiction of Rule 1 in capitalism. You do not allow your owners to be powerless.
Well, you have talked a lot and written a lot in your books about political and justice fatigue, and you say this is a cop-out, but that voters have grown so dismayed with the political choices of, worse and then more worse, and they don't want any part of this corrupt system of politics. And you said that's a cop-out.
It's a total cop-out. Unless you have a disability or you're otherwise totally preoccupied with ailments in your family and trying to make ends meet with daycare, and you know the story. Most people make excuses for themselves about why they are not, in Jefferson's phrase, crucial participants in building a democratic society and all the good that comes from it. They have all excuses. Number one, they don't have time. Number two, they don't know what the rules are of Robert's Rules of Order and going to town meetings and so on. Number three, they don't want to be embarrassed and be criticized. Number four, even if they had time, even if they knew the rules, even if they weren't blistered by moonbeams, nothing would happen anyway. The big boys would always have their way. It's a complete cop-out. Says who? Says less than 1% of the people that brought us the blessings of justice and liberty for over 200 years. It has never taken more than 1% of active, committed people, locally, state, national, international, around issues that they know can be accurately advanced, as long as they have the support of public opinion. It has never taken more than 1%. Whether it's civil rights movement, civil liberties, women's movement, you name it. It's never taken more than 1%, with the exception of the Civil War. For all these justice movements, labor movement, consumer movement, environmental movement, student rights movement, they say the 60s were aroused on campus, and they were. But it never was more than 1% of the students actually spending a lot of time throughout the course of the year, but they represented the felt injustices of a majority of the students who once in a while turned out for them.
But you have said that you have felt encouraged that since your time in the 60s, that you've seen more mobilization against this diatribe that's just come forward than you have in decades, and so that you feel hope. And do you think, we talked about this earlier, is it the right-left convergence on issues, or is it more this a racist, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner rhetoric that is arousing this mobilization.
Yeah, but that's okay. I mean, to be provoked by racism, anti-Semitism, not just against Jews, but against Arabs, that's the other anti-Semitism. Blocking all refugees from Syria by Trump. If you ever did that to Israel, he'd be impeached yesterday. So, and misogyny, misogyny, that's okay, but it's not far enough. People tend to fight each other when they're desperate, when they're sinking economically. They'll blame the people, underneath them on the economic ladder. The corporations have planned everything they can plan in our country. They strategically plan. That's what they do. These are the big corporations, not small business. They strategically plan our elections, money, candidates. They strategically plan our government. They put their own people in high positions. They strategically plan our food, junk food. They plan our environment, deciding how much pollution they're going to emit if the law doesn't chase them. They strategically plan commercializing childhood, circumventing parental authority, direct marketing, junk food, violent programming, and making it interactive. What kind of society lets them get away with that kind of electronic child molestation? They're completely planning our genetic inheritance. They're planning our tax system. They've planned our retirement pension system, converting it from a set check every month to this 401k. Isn't it time that we planned our own future? They planned the military budget. They planned the allocation of our tax dollars. They plan how much corporate welfare and bailouts they're going to get. That's the central issue of our society. Have you ever seen a major corporation liberate its employees for a peace march? They're into war contracts. They're into tunnel vision, maximizing short-term gain, and lathering it with greed and power. That's the essential struggle for justice in our world today. They're the ones who back up the dictatorships, who support our overthrowing countries that might want to take over their oil, like Iran in 1953. And that's not taught in school. That's not part of your curriculum. You're not taught how right here at Scripps you can become the most powerful school in the country and teach your students civics and civic experience in the process, how to practice democracy. You have a course called Congress 101, where you study your 2 senators and representatives every semester. You become the most important factor in the state because you can disseminate all kinds of this information and get course credit. In your physics and chemistry lab, you can study soils. You can test local drinking water. If colleges did that in Michigan, you wouldn't have had a Flint, Michigan lead epidemic. It's not hard to test drinking water. Protocols for heavy metals. All kinds of things can come out when you define freedom as participation in power. When you remember an ancient Chinese philosopher who said, to know and not to do is not to know. To know and not to do is not to know. That should reverberate throughout academic campuses. Bring it alive. Doesn't require more money, just requires educational courage by your administrators, your faculty, and a higher estimate of your own significance as students. You're not just going to be well-oiled, paid cogs in a corporate wheel or a government bureaucracy. Your mission is much greater than that. And it's up to you to use your classes when you're as free as you're ever likely to be to think, question, and challenge in your life. It's up to you to use those classes, see what your mission, what kind of world you want. You've got about 20,000 days. That's all you have. How fast did last week go? Don't waste your 20s trying to figure out who you are.
There's the Muslim ban, there's the wall, all this anti-immigrant sentiment, and I had asked you, what do you if anything, do you think is a good thing that has come out of the first 100 days of the Trump administration? And we talked about, when asked about Putin and his atrocities, Mr. Trump, President Trump, responded by saying, "And you think the U.S. is so innocent." What do you make of that response?
That was the most candid, smart response he's ever made. Maybe it took Bill O'Reilly to provoke him. No other president has admitted that, which is that in our wars, we've set records, apart from the Nazis. We've set records for killing civilians. Let's face it, empire kills civilians. It starves them, it oppresses them, it blows them up. We blew up Hiroshima and Nagasaki deliberately, quote, to terrorize the population. They were bombs aimed at schools and residential areas, just like firebombing by the U.S. and Britain of Dresden, 70,000 incinerated in one night, 100,000 incinerated in Tokyo in one night. Now, they would have done the same to us, but when we engaged in that criminal invasion of Iraq, which was unconstitutional, violation of federal laws, violation of international law by George W. Bush and Cheney, we blew apart that society. We killed over 1 million Iraqis, 5 million out of 25 million refugees. It was so extensive it could only be called sociocide. Starvation, disease, a functioning society that was done into the ground by the despot who never threatened us. So we're going to go around overthrowing despots. Then, as Colin Powell once said, you invaded Iraq, you own it, which means we were responsible for law and order, protection of civilian life, maintaining critical public facilities, which we did not do. Another violation of international law. So let's look at ourselves in the mirror. Who has overthrown more regimes since World War II? Number one, USA. Who has interfered in more elections to this day, including Russia? The USA. So we're getting a little bit of our own medicine from Putin and some emails. What a horror.
So you have often written and have said for many, many years that we've needed to disrupt the two-party system, that it's been corrupt for decades. Is this the great disruption, then, that we've been waiting for? Is this our great opportunity, as you've said?
This is a great showdown in American democracy. There's no more camouflage, no more pretense, no more slogans. Wall Street has come to Washington. Goldman Sachs, they got 5 of their top executives in top positions, one right next to Donald Trump in the Oval Office. And what did he say when he talked to all those blue-collar workers? He was going to be their voice. He was going to be the person taking care of Wall Street. He sure is taking care of Wall Street. And he's in the process of betraying them. They're very patient. They're giving him more opportunities. They're a bit appalled at what they see already going on.
It's a fine-tuned machine, he says. 35% love him.
A fine-tuned machine of chaos. The only good thing about his chaos is he can't get enough bad people in office to start the damage early enough. He's going to have to face the civil servant, which has a sense of what's lawful, and they know how to resist. I hope he's going to face people in the streets and town meetings and focusing on members of Congress. That's the key. You don't have mass rallies where the energy goes into the ether. You got to laser beam in on your senators and representatives. By the way, have you ever seen NRA and AIPAC engage in mass demonstrations on Congress? Are you kidding? They focus on 535 people. How much money do they want? Who are their doctors? Who are their friends? Who do they play golf with? What's the vulnerability of their staff? Who are they afraid of in primary elections? That's what we have to learn to do. Not just rallies, very important, for morale. Laser beam on members of Congress. Once you change Congress, it's a new ballgame. Congress is the tiniest branch of government with the greatest constitutional authority by far against the other two branches of government. Taxing, appropriation, war, confirmation nominees, investigative power. And we know their names. What are we waiting for? 1% turns out, you scare them. 5% turns out, you replace them.
So the question is, how did we even get to this place? We've seen the collapse of both parties. And you've said only in America can you win the popular vote and lose the election to the Electoral College. So give me your kind of state of the state of how we arrived at a Trump presidency.
We first arrived by people spending 8 to 10 hours of their daily life watching screens instead of looking into each other's eyes and meeting personally in town meetings and living rooms. You know, you should read a book called The First American Revolution by Ray Raphael. It started a year before Lexington and Concord in western and central Massachusetts. It started with the farmers. When King George passed a law that replaced their judges and their sheriffs, they decided they were going to mobilize, and they would turn out 500 to 1,000 farmers and surround the Tories in their community and demand they repent. Totally nonviolent. They'd surround the homes, and they'd have a pathway. And they would say, you repent, or we will shun you. We will boycott the courts. We will not do business with you. Can you imagine a turnout like that today, proportionate to the population? They shame us. Half of democracy is showing up. How many of you have desperately called people who agree with you? Please, can you come to this rally? Will you please take this petition board and get signatures for a referendum? Will you please come out and vote for this candidate? You have to beg them to save themselves. Back in my hometown, we pass out $2 bills. Have you ever seen the picture on the $2 bill? It's a picture of the men who came together on July 4th, 1776, to sign the Declaration of Independence. I know what the politically correct characterization, bunch of white males, slave owners, merchants, yuck. They thought they were signing their death warrant by King George III, the most powerful military on earth. And they brought certain rights to the forefront, however hypocritical their personal enslavers might be. And they did it because they showed up. And it's time we show up. Students have shown up less to convocations like this than any students in the last 40 years all over the country. There are great civic activists who no longer go to campus, who no longer can get an audience, unless they happen to be a residual celebrity. You can make them stronger just by showing up. And when you show up, you see the potential of your own leadership. What's happening with all these rallies, they're not orchestrated. They're creating their own leaders. And that's what you have to do in your generation. You've got to create your own leaders. And I don't mean just political leaders. Leaders in literature, leaders in art, leaders in community organizing, leaders in running for office. Democracy is a many-splendored demand on human talents. And you should be happy that you still live in a country that allows you to do that without sending you to jail. But the time is running out, and don't wear out your luck.
You have made very clear that you do not believe that any Russian hacking of the DNC made any impact on the elections. You've made that clear. You say we had a horrible candidate in Hillary Clinton, and we had a President Barack Obama, who did not galvanize his base when he could. What led to this opportunity for a Trump to emerge as our president?
Well, you know, when you don't have enough people participating intelligently in politics, and you don't have to be just conservative or liberal to be intelligent in politics, the politicians rigged the system. First, they fought your right to vote. You know, they wanted the state legislatures to elect the Senate, which they did for a while, or property holders only voting. When we got universal suffrage, then they started rigging the voting patterns. Today we call it gerrymandering, where the politicians, depending on who's in charge of state government, Republican, Democrat, pick the voters. Can you imagine that? How about that for a silent coup d'etat? They pick the voters where they don't even have opposition from the major party in these redistricts all over the country. The second is they all dial for the same commercial money. And money is not just pulling strings. It has awful, awful effects in terms of who runs for office, what kind of primaries you have, what kind of debates you're going to have, what kind of issues you're going to put on the table. Most of the major issues that the American people agree with, supported by left-right, are never mentioned by the Democrat-Republican candidates. Go to my website, votenader.org, for 2008 campaign. You'll see 18 issues that the majority of the people pretty much want discussed and support, taken off the table by both Republican and Democrat parties and candidates. So they do rig the system. And that demoralizes you. That leads to so much apathy. You know what they do on apathy is the cry of the apathetic. And we were so desperate in 2008 to get any media. Even though I was fairly well known, I was shut out by the reporters. You can't win. Why should we report you? Well, I'm pushing all kinds of issues that have majority support for change. Isn't that enough? No. Look at you in the polls. But the system is rigged for two parties. No. Look at you in the polls. It's like a vicious circle. So we had an oath of the apathetic. We wanted people who were apathetic in the country to declare their apathy and band together. And the oath of the apathetic, it's on votenader.org if you want to have a little fun. But basically, the cry of the apathetic is that they don't know and they don't care. Notice the combination. They don't know and they don't care. And when more and more people drop out of the electoral system because they're so fed up and disgusted with it, they're playing into the hands of the destruction of our democratic society. They're playing into the hands of further concentration of power in the hands of the few. So don't make excuses for anybody who tells you they don't want to vote, they don't want to run for local election, they don't want to canvass door to door. Dropping out of democracy is the first way to destroy democracy. So be a little tough with each other. Put down the cell phone, you know.
This is coming from a man who does not have YouTube or Facebook or you have an iPhone. Is that right, Mr. Nader?
No iPhone, no email, no, none of the stuff. Who needs it? It's a distraction. I mean, there are teenagers today who send 600 text messages a day. What's the urgency?
So with both houses and controlled by the right, and obviously the presidency, the checks and balances, are you confident that Schumer and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie are going to be able to take up the mantle? And what role should Barack Obama play in becoming the voice of the Democratic Party?
Well, I think he's going to build his library and he's going to do good things, I suppose, like Jimmy Carter has done. But he's heavily responsible for the losses of his party. He was a brilliant politician for Barack Obama. And in 2008, he had huge control in Congress. And he blew it. It was all about him. He didn't like to campaign with other Democrats. And he had a flawed strategy going forward with Obamacare instead of a whole brace of changes that would have gotten more and more public support. Some people care about health care, some people care about tax reform, some people care about empowerment, some people care about consumer protection. You get more people that way. And then, of course, the losses at the state legislature level and in the governor, the Republicans dominate everything. The worst Republican party in history. I would like to document that if we had more time. The worst Republican party in history controls our state and national government. That is the extent of the default of the corporate indentured, myopic Democratic Party.
In your opinion, what is Obama's greatest achievement and what will be his legacy?
Well, his greatest achievement was Obamacare, which was partial, and the fact that a black man became president. That was a great breakthrough. The problem is that he lost the rest of the party's discipline. He was not willing to do what was necessary in those 2 critical years, which we had overwhelming control of the House and Senate, and he blew it. And that's going to be his tragedy. Very smart, very articulate, but I think if you look back, it was a lack of gumption when he had control of the Congress. You got to go for it. You don't get second chances in politics. Not when you have unscrupulous corporate money with an unscrupulous Republican Party undermining you at all levels. But remember, for 2 years, he had great majorities in the House and Senate, and he blew it. He didn't even get a minimum wage. He didn't even put a minimum wage up, something that could have lifted the wages of 30 million people, many of whom ended up turning Republican and voting for Donald Trump.
Did you meet with President Obama during his 8 years?
He wouldn't meet with me. I met him once as a senator. He walked into Harry Reid's office, the Democratic majority leader of the Senate, and we had something in common. He spent a few months with the New York Public Interest Research Group, which I started. And I remember he gave me a funny look when he went into the office, just happened to meet him. And I said, let's get together. And he said, yeah. And we called for months, and he never had time. And it turned out he didn't want to know what I had to say. And what I had to say was that he had to take on corporate power. If he didn't take on Wall Street was going to own him. And money was going to own him. And he went 500 times out of town to raise money in 8 years as president. 500 times to fat cat fundraisers. That's not the best use of his time. He should have gone out to rally the country around a broader agenda when he had a majority in Congress, that priceless 2 years, 2009 and 2010. But he would never meet. He was not interested in meeting with any critics from a progressive angle. That's true for a lot of Democrats, too, by the way.
How about Hillary Clinton?
Even worse. Hillary and Bill didn't like me. And it's because, I don't say this pompously, I had their number. I knew the difference between their rhetoric and their record. I knew how they turned more and more of the government over into corporate hands. But they kept the rhetoric, the civil rights rhetoric. And, they're very good with that. And it's very important to call politicians on their rhetoric, because that's the way they camouflage their rhetoric, their record from your perusal.
Did you see yourself in Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, Bernie's been a Lone Ranger. I've known him from before he was mayor of Burlington. And he doesn't like to be told how to be more progressive. He's very progressive, but he doesn't like to be told how to be more progressive, foreign and military affairs, for example. And he's got a lot of arms industry in Vermont. He's not been as tough on them. He's a great senator, but he's a lone ranger. And when he ran for office, no one was more surprised than he that he almost won the nomination. And I think he would have won it if it wasn't rigged, not just in the primaries, not just in the primaries, but the fact that she locked up most of the non-voting delegates, like her members of Congress. 20% were non-voting delegates. That's a huge handicap for Bernie to overcome. But I think if he was given a fair treatment in Iowa, Nevada, and he won New Hampshire, it might have been a different race. Make no mistake about it. He's a wonderful pro-labor, pro-consumer, pro-peace member of the Senate. But he's got his own set ways, and I've been trying to meet with him for 19 years to no avail, and I'm only a few blocks away.
Would you have advised him to stay in and not try to influence the Clinton platform with his progressive agenda?
I just think he influenced it verbally, and the Clintons are very good at verbal garbage. They'll tell you what you want to hear until they get you out of the way. And then they'll move in to further corporatize the government and the country. Remember, Clinton has pushed through NAFTA, WTO, TPP, tried to support, Obama with. He's the one who raised more money from Wall Street than any Democratic candidate ever in American history. He's the one who shorted the labor movement. He was very, very clever the way he did it. And one way you could expose him is what he wouldn't introduce in the Congress, who he wouldn't associate with, who he raised money from. He triangulated the Congress. He cut deals with Gingrich, which were horrible legislation, Agribusiness Accountability Act, Telecommunications Act, and so forth. So we have to say Bernie took it a long way, and he wasn't a registered Democrat. Remember that. And they could have drummed him out of the party. I think he settled for too little, and he could have waited a bit longer. But the Democrats are merciless toward people on the progressive side of their spectrum. In fact, one of their historic functions has been to neutralize, co-opt, or destroy the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They've been very, very successful at that.
We'll talk about your controversial 2000 run and the accusations you were a spoiler, etc. But I'd like to go back a bit and talk about a young Ralph Nader in Winsted, Connecticut, the son of a Lebanese father, an immigrant family, youngest of four.
Yes.
Where did you get your drive to push forward, fight for democracy? Never wanted to marry. You always said you were married to the mission of advocating for citizen and consumer rights. Where did that come from?
First, I had a lucky choice of parents.
Because your father was very political.
And my mother. They raised us to be significant citizens. They came over, as my father once told people in his restaurant, who would always say, Nader, you're always criticizing. Why don't you go back where you came from? He said, because when I sailed past the Statue of Liberty in 1912, I took it seriously. Do you? He always turned the question on them. Do you take it seriously enough to fight for it? Do you take it seriously enough to support progressive people running for election who might not be members of the two parties? Do you take it seriously enough to run yourself for local office? Do you take it seriously enough to know what happens to societies who don't take their civic duties seriously enough? They used to say in Nader's restaurant, for a dime, you got a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of political discussion.
And I understand, too, at your dinner table, your father or mother would give you a question, a political question or a headline of the day to really talk about at the table with the family.
Yeah, it's in the book, 17 Traditions. And they're just wonderful questions that got us thinking, sometimes dealing with local situations, local politics, national, international. My mother never read to us because she wanted to look in our eyes, and she always spoke stories to us, fables, historical events. She wanted to have us look at each other's eyes. So she never went like this, you know.
So there would be no iPhones in your house if it were today, no.
No, I guess my parents asked a lot of questions. They're very, very questioning. And because they came from the tyrannical Ottoman Empire, they really appreciated our democratic society to an extent where they felt they had to participate in it. And my father would say to us, "You'll lose your rights if you don't use your rights. You have to use your rights to keep your rights." I remember once we were in the backyard, it was a beautiful day, and my mother, she had such a wonderful way of educating us. She looked up and she said, "Look at the beautiful sun. How much is that worth in dollars? You hear the birds? What is the price in money of those birds singing? Isn't that a nice breeze? How much is that worth?" We didn't know what she was getting at. He said, "Do you know the price of a pound of bananas?" Yeah, we knew the price. You know what she was getting at? That some of the most important things in life are priceless. Priceless. She wanted us to understand that, because that's what a lot of justice is all about. And to have a mother and father like that, what's my excuse, right? And the other thing was, I had a couple great teachers once in a while. I had a couple great teachers. I had a 5th grade teacher walks in once, and she puts on, her name was Miss Thompson, and she put on the blackboard 60 seconds. And then she turned to us, she said, "What is that, children?" We said, 60 seconds. And she said, "You make sure you don't waste it, because when you waste it, it's going to be gone forever and you'll never get it back." It's just little things like that. Then I had a lucky choice of brother and 2 sisters. My brother bought us the first encyclopedia. And he said, "You should read in it. It won't be part of your courses. Pick it up. You pick the A to B or the R to S." He was like 18, just out of the Navy. Imagine having a brother like that. So he introduced me to Hawaii in the encyclopedia. And he said, "Look at Hawaii. Look how they're saying in the encyclopedia that the Queen of Hawaii was not treating the planters right, and the Hawaiian people invited the U.S. Marines to free the Hawaiian natives." Completely false in the Encyclopedia Americana. And he had me read it, and he gave me the truth. Imagine having a big brother like that. I was very, very fortunate.
Fortunate also to go on to Princeton and then Harvard Law, and then really rise to prominence with your book in 1965, Unsafe at Any Speed, which really just launched your advocacy movement with taking on behemoth GM, General Motors, and their dangerous death trap of a Corvair.
Because I lost friends in high school, college, and law school to cars that should have saved them crashes. There were no seatbelts, no airbags, no padded dash panels, weak door locks, steering columns that would be a spear, and left front collisions. So I remembered all of my friends who were killed in survivable crashes. I wrote a third-year paper at Harvard Law School, which went into the book Unsafe at Speed. But in the meantime, GM hired private detectives to follow me. They made one mistake. They followed me to the U.S. Senate and got caught.
They also sent women into grocery stores to seduce you.
Yes, they did.
But he was unseducible.
It was so transparent. They private hired detectives who used that ploy. They've used that ploy before with other dissenters, of course.
When I watched the documentary and read this, it's such a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, epic battle, David and Goliath, and you're in the Senate hearings, and there's the head of GM, there's Bobby Kennedy, there's all these senators, and there's you, this young man, taking on this, behemoth, and you won. What did that feel like, to have your singular efforts? And you had to push it through to the journalists, to the, just to get it noticed, and to fight off this campaign to smear you. What did it feel like to actually understand and experience your power as a citizen working?
Well, it's due to my upbringing. I was resistant to the laurelies of fame. I became very famous. I was one of the top 10 most famous people in the country. And it didn't go to my head because of the way I was raised by my mother and father. And they were very clear about it. Whenever we had swell heads as children, they knew how to deflate it. And so when the time came when I could have fallen prey to the laurelies of fame and huge wealth and flattery, I had a built-in resistance to it. That was one. The second is I felt a huge burden of trust by people all over the country who thought I was going to solve any problem, get rid of air pollution, make nursing homes safe, make our food healthy, clean up politics. I mean, the expectation levels were just huge. And I had a sense of tranquility by my upbringing where I didn't go into a nervous breakdown or I didn't get into a celebrity mode. And I'm very thankful for my parents for the way they raised us in very, very sober fashion.
So not only did you, really revolutionize the auto industry to take on real safeguards to protect us in our automobiles, but you also got a settlement for the privacy abuses by GM. And you took that money, which at the time was a lot of money. It's a lot of money today, but more so then, over $400,000. And you launched your Citizen Watch Group advocacy initiatives and groups, Nader's Raiders as well, as they were deemed. You took that money to even launch more investigations into a myriad of consumer interests.
Yeah, I knew one person couldn't take on big business, great discovery, and I didn't want to be a Lone Ranger, and so I took a lot of young people from colleges, including high school students from Connecticut, to investigate nursing home abuses and law schools, engineering schools. And people say, Nader, what are you, crazy, bringing all these young people? What do they know? They're wet behind the ears. And I said to them, wait and see. They have a sense of justice. They're willing to work hard. They know how to filter fiction from fact, and they're motivated. You want to add anything else? And they became famous. They were called Nader's Raiders. I had them author books. They testified before Congress. Imagine 6 18-year-old girls from a school in Connecticut testifying before the Congress on nursing home abuses, having just written a book. And I consider that a great privilege of living in this country, that we can do that. But if we're not serious about our freedom, we're going to lose them. If we're not serious about justice, we're going to be losing them. And we've seen it now, haven't we? Where you have the richest country in the world, mired in poverty, mired in desperate people, mired in people dying by the thousands because they can't afford health insurance, mired in debt. We're raising a whole generation of Americans in debt to their neck. Imagine a society of elders allowing that to happen, and all the consequences of curtailing their creativity because of debt into their 20s, into their 30s. No Western country allows that. They don't have student debt in most of the Western countries in the world. It's just like high school. Why do we allow that? Because we don't pick up the duties and blessings of our civic rights. And if we did, as you can see in the last month, this country's coming alive because Trump is making one serious error. It's one thing for the rich and powerful to take away what is rightfully yours that you do not have, like a living wage, like universal health insurance, like a clean corporate behavior, like fair taxation, like advocacy for peace, waging peace in the world. But what Trump's big mistake is, with his greedy corporate nominees, is he wants to take away what you now have. And that's rebellion in America, USA. That's the mistake they're making. That's why you see students out in the streets, high school, college. That's why you're seeing all this coming together, left, right. You're seeing Trump voters now beginning to demonstrate against pipelines. So stay tuned. It's Trump and the plutocrats and the corporations who have taken over the U.S. government more than any time before. The militarists, the corporatists, and not a few racists against the American people.
Mr. Nader, let me, before we open it up to questions, I would like to ask you about your various runs for presidency, because you've always come in, you first because you did not want the fame. You turned down the first time that you were asked to run for president with the Progressive Party of the Democratic Party. And then again, you ran either as a third-party candidate, a write-in, or the Green Party, and you always came in third. But we're always denied legitimacy. You went to meet with Gore, and he would not meet with you in 2000. You really felt that there were woeful issues that affected consumer and citizen rights that were not being addressed, and you felt it important to run. As you know, you have been called a spoiler in that campaign that handed the victory to Bush and part of who is responsible for the Iraq War. You have refuted this consistently. You felt it was your right and your duty to run. Would you make any change today on that decision, having watched what Bernie had done?
This is the ultimate arrogance of the two-party duopoly, isn't it? First of all, Gore won the election. He won the popular vote. That should have been the end of it in most countries, huh? But the Electoral College threw it into Florida, where the corruption of the campaign in Florida and the intercession by the Supreme Court, blocking the Supreme Court of Florida's ordering of a recount, handed it to Bush, plus all the corruption out of Tallahassee that we know about. I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible for Gore losing his home state of Tennessee. I'm responsible for manipulating the ballots, the butterfly ballots. I'm responsible for all the corruption in Florida. It's absurd. It's all scapegoating. That's what we have to get over with. We all have an equal right to run for election.
I think it's very interesting for the students. Excuse me for interrupting, but I'm on a time limit and I want to open it up. But I think it's a very interesting point, and what fascinates me most about you, and I think for the students in the room will as well, when you're met with such huge opposition by the establishment and made to feel as if you do not belong and you do not have those rights, you have a fortitude and an ability to stand up in the face of so much resistance. And where did you get that confidence or that conviction? Your parents, yes, but is there another driver that has had you stand up for our democracy for decades?
You say your parents, yes. You know, that's just a minor factor. It's the major factor. Parental upbringing is the major factor. If you don't have that, you can't get other opportunities. So, to answer your question very briefly, something in me made me unable to stand bullies from age 4 and up. I would get a lot of bloody noses interposing a 7th grader beating up a 4th grader. I could not viscerally stand bullying of any kind. So when I grew up, I realized that the big bullies were corporations, big corporations, and politicians, and others who had more power than they deserved against the people who had less power than they deserved. It's a pretty simple motivation. It's something we have to learn to communicate to each other. You cannot have a sense of justice if you don't have a sense of injustice. And you know that. People in this country who built justice in this country, they got their motivation, whether they're women, African Americans, Hispanics, you name it. They got it because they developed a cultivated sense of injustice that gave them that motivation to persevere and to prevail against all kinds of opposition and depredations and brutality. So I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing, but we all have it within us. I've never met anybody without a sense of injustice. You just have to bring it to the surface, learn to control it, don't infect it with too much hubris and certainty, keep options open to revision, as Alfred North Whitehead once said, the great British mathematician, philosopher, and keep reading and keep thinking and have a higher estimate of your own significance in life. You got 15 to 20,000 days. Make the most of it.
Mr. Ralph Nader. I guess you're going to have to accept your fame.
Thank you.
We'd now like to open it up to questions from all of you. If you please raise your hand, and we'll make sure a microphone gets to you. So, do we have any questions? Please. To the gentleman in the green shirt.
Thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Nader. You're a great hero of mine, someone I've followed the political career of for a long time. It's a real honor to be able to speak to you finally. My question is about political strategy moving forward. I think there's a lot of confusion in the meetings that I've been to right now about what the best course of action is to effectively resist the Trump presidency. A lot of more traditional dyed-in-the-wool blue, capital D Democrats want to work within the party. A lot of Bernie-crats want to work within the party to fundamentally reform it. As someone who's run in the Green Party, I wonder what your perspective is on, is the Green Party the new People's Party? Do we need to found a new party because of the negative associations the Green Party has with a lot of more centrist voters, or do we reform the Democratic Party from the inside? Thank you.
All of the above. I'm not one to foreclose options. To each his own. Some people can't stand to compromise their ideals and go into a Democrat or Republican Party. Go for an independent candidate. Go for a third party. Let many forces of justice be splendored. So I like more voices and choices. Number two, there are people who tend to be a bit, quote, practical, and they know it's a rigged two-party system. Winner take all, no multi-party voting, etc. So they want to work inside. And you see now churning movements inside the Democratic Party, often associated with Bernie Sanders' campaign. You're seeing groups that are just civic movements that now are, for example, providing a lot of these rallies and these demonstrations using the internet. So I'm for many flowers erupting on the political landscape. Now, in terms of practical strategy, I think the Republican Party is going to overplay its hand in Congress and state legislatures, but it would be good if we had the Democratic Party forcing its hand, so there has to be a new generation inside the Democratic Party. The idea of Nancy Pelosi losing the House in 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016, and being reelected minority leader is a bit much. What's the price for failure? And she's suppressing a younger movement of Democrats to come to the forefront. As far as the strategy of the moment, I would put it on 535 men and women who are in the Congress and who want to be reelected. And the town meetings have to be full of people, left, right, conservative, liberal are bleeding the same way and in many, many different modalities of their daily life. They should unify, get over their differences, and connect with their similarities, which is why one of my books is called, deals with the left-right convergence. On most major issues, believe it or not, there's left-right convergence, but they're not highlighted by the two parties who thrive on a smaller number of left-right differences. I have 24 areas of convergence, left-right. They're very important. They deal with war and peace. They deal with workers. They deal with consumers. They deal with the environment. And we've got to have a left-right convergence, and then nothing can stop it in terms of political opposition. We'll get the country that we deserve. So I think there's a lot going on last month. Take advantage of it. When you get high school students pouring out of high schools in Chicago and New York, rallying for educational assistance and improving the educational budget and repairing their schools, that's a very good sign. And I think we're going to see more of that. It just takes 1% of the people who are really active, representing the majority opinion, to turn the tide almost anywhere. Just give me 1% of the people spending 200 to 300 hours a year and opening up full-time offices with 2 or 4 people in each congressional district, and there isn't anything that's unjust in this country that cannot be changed in any institutional sense, whether it's the war budget, whether it's corporate crime, whether it's rapacious banks, redlining areas, whether it's a corrupt healthcare system, you name it. Never takes more than 1% reflecting majority opinion.
Also, in Breaking Through Power, there's a step-by-step guideline on how to organize in your community. So check it out. Are there any other questions? Please.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. My name's Delphine. I'm a senior here at the Claremont Colleges. As you said, you don't believe you are single-handedly responsible for Bush's 2000 victory. Do you think you played any role, however, in inhibiting Gore's victory? And also, do you see Bernie Sanders, Jill Stein, or Gary Johnson playing a similar role in the 2016 election? And what role, if any, do you think third parties can play in presidential elections?
First of all, I don't think the word spoiler should be used in a democracy. It's a bigoted word by 2 major parties against anybody who challenges it. Second, there are studies that show actually that more people voted for Gore because they feared my candidacy than voted for me. For example, in a poll right after the election, turned out about 25% of the people who voted for me would have voted for Bush. 39% would have voted for Gore, and the rest would have stayed home. So this idea of scapegoating minority candidates is nothing more than a strategy by the 2 parties to entrench themselves and define dissent as unpatriotic. And we should be very careful that we should be very careful and note our history. The greatest movements for justice in our history, except for the GI Bill of Rights, started with third parties. The Liberty Party against slavery in 1840, the Women's Suffrage Party, the Farmer Labor Parties, you name it, all the way. They're the ones who put forth the changes and reforms. They're the ones to the ballot for them. They're the ones who threw it up against the two-party entrenched candidates. And it took a while, but they broke through again and again. How can we degrade that seed corn for the resurgence and renewal of a democratic society? That's what I call two-party bigotry, and we shouldn't tolerate it.
It's a pleasure listening to you today, Mr. Nader. I'm a very big fan. I actually wrote an essay about you last semester.
Would you get a good grade?
I did. I'm a student at Pomona College, which is right across the street, and I wanted to ask how you deal with the lack of government transparency, not just in Trump's administration with his lack of releasing of his own tax records, but also in previous administrations, whereas we wouldn't know of drone strikes that were occurring around countries, or we wouldn't know about the trade deal and how we can alleviate problems in the government if we are unaware of them.
Well, of course, Trump has gotten away with not disclosing his tax records. Now, there's no legal requirement for that. You fill out forms and you meet certain requirements of the Federal Election Commission. However, he's made a big deal issue of his business prowess, of all the great deals, of all the people he's helped. And when you put your business career as part of arguing to become president in front of the voters, then you have to disclose the kinds of information in his tax returns. So you see, who are his partners? What deal did he cut overseas? How's he compromised himself? What kind of tax advantages has he taken? He finally had to admit he hardly paid any income tax. And unfortunately, he refused to do that. The press battered him, and some of his opponents chided him, but he got away with it. And it's very unfortunate, because I think if he disclosed it, he might have had political troubles in getting the nomination, because he's a guy known to cut corners. So I think in terms of the general tenor of the question, I don't like a society that's full of mea culpas, but there comes a point when we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and saying, how did we allow all this? Did we allow all this to happen before because we didn't provide third-party and independent candidate competition, national, state, local? Did we allow all this to happen because we were too preoccupied with our private lives to put forward our public lives as citizens? Do we allow all this to happen because we didn't do our homework about the candidates who were on the ballot, local, state, national? Did we allow this to happen because we were so cynical about politics that we thought it was all dirty and we didn't want to have any part of it, allowing the scoundrels to thrive and expand? Did we have a role in it because we didn't run for local office, Board of Education? We often just had one party on the ticket, which deprives the voter of any choice completely. You know, what's our mea culpa here? Half of the people don't vote, 2/3 don't vote in congressional elections. There comes a time when a democracy deteriorates to such a perilous level that we have to wake up in the morning and look at ourselves in the mirror. Because the hope for democracy starts with the people. It doesn't start with Congress or governors, or state legislature. And when it's lost in the mind and spirit of the people, no laws are going to rescue it. And we're coming close to that line, although thank goodness for Trump provoking a turnaround. The one thing about Trump, he's going to get us mad. He's going to get us angry. He's going to get us having a sense of our unfilled potential as engaged citizens and committed voters, demanding a wide array of choices and voices for ourselves.
A famous quote by Mr. Nader is, if when people say to him, well, we're not turned on to politics, he has said in the past, then politics will turn on you. Before I leave you and we leave you, I think it's worth mentioning, and we couldn't be here long enough to really read the list, but because of this man sitting beside me, we have mandatory seatbelts, airbags, the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, the Consumer Protection Act, Clean Water Act, Freedom of Information Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Whistleblower Act, and the list goes on and on and on. Mr. Ralph Nader. It's his 83rd birthday next week.
Let me say,
Sure.
First of all, thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. Second of all, thank you. You all could have done it without me.
Probably not true. Mr. Nader turns 83 years old next week on the 27th of February, so wish him a very happy birthday. Thank you for all you've done. Shall we?
On behalf of Scripps
Have you,
College.
By the way, if you want to extend all this, there are books out there. Reading is still very important to thinking. And how many of you have ever heard of CalPIRG, the California Public Interest Research Group? Ask yourself why you're not part of it, if you're not. It's a student movement. We helped start in California in the 1970s. They have full-time staff. They've run statewide initiatives. They've done wonderful work. Sometimes the student gets course credit for that work. And there's no reason why Scripps cannot be a member of it, as well as at all the colleges in this area. It's civic action by the hand of the students organizing. It's learning by doing. It's learning how to practice democracy. It's applying knowledge to action. It's increasing the fiber and the rationale of your education in ways that will last the rest of your life. So consider calling your fellow students at CalPIRG and having them come and speak with you and see if you can join and become battlers for a democratic society and for justice, the great work of human beings on earth. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mickey Huff and Matt Witt and Jonathan Reed and President Lieberman for the invitation. You can see how fast 20 years goes. Speaking of time, I like to say to students that they have about 15 to 20,000 days in their active life, and 2,500 weeks or so. Did last week go quickly? And most people think yes. And so the lesson of that is not to waste your 20s trying to figure out who you were when you were an adolescent. and to have a high estimate of your own significance in advancing justice in the world, because that's the great work of human beings on earth. Without justice, there's no liberty and no freedom. And my subject today is to try to demonstrate that ordinary people have always done the extraordinary things throughout American history. And all the great changes, abolition of slavery, women's right to vote, the whole farmer, labor, progressive movements in the late 19th century, and the more modern anti-war movements, environment, consumer, labor in the 20th century. They all started by a handful of people who often never were active. They had a sense of injustice, and they were motivated, and they respected themselves as citizens. They didn't just give up and make excuses like they don't have time and they don't like to be criticized in public and so forth. And they made history. And even at the peak, with the exception of the Civil War, even at the peak of the movement, civil rights movement, women's rights movement more recently, there never was close to 1% of the people actively engaged. That's all it took. 1% or less actively engaged, a couple hundred hours a year, connected with each other, maybe supporting some full-time small citizen groups. 1% or less it takes, as long as A, they have their facts in order and know how to argue the case, and B, they represent public opinion. That's the key. If they represent public opinion, and there are tremendous changes in this country that can be made already supported by conservative and liberal public opinion, which you almost never hear about in the news because all you hear about is where they dislike each other or they oppose each other, reproductive rights or school prayer, gun control, etc. But in major transformations of living wage, full Medicare for all with free choice of doctor and hospital, cracking down on corporate crime and abuse against consumers and patients and children and taxpayers and workers, breaking up the big New York banks, that comes in at 90%, because if they're too big to fail, as conservative columnists once put George Will, they should be too big to exist. And criminal justice reform, left-right support on that, already getting legislation through to reduce some of those absurd jail sentences for teenagers caught with a few drugs in their hand. There's a great support for civil liberties. Conservatives, liberals don't like the restrictions in the Patriot Act, or the police can search your home, not tell you for 72 hours, or go into your medical and financial records and invading your privacy, on and on. And once you get a left-right coalition going on members of Congress or legislature in Sacramento, it's over. It's an unstoppable political force. I've seen it happen in Washington. When conservative liberals go into a senator's office and say, we want you to vote for the Whistleblower Protection Act, blowing the whistle on corporate fraud on the U.S. government, they don't know how to handle it. They know how to game the liberal. They know how to game the conservative. It's over. And so don't let anybody tell you this is a highly polarized society. It's highly polarized by design in areas of opposition between left and right. I just gave some examples. But it's in the interest of the two major political parties to divide and rule. That's the way they raise their money, by being on one side or the other on some hot-button issues. But the issues of convergence and agreement, they're not there. They can't handle that politically. They can't go to their liberal fundraisers or their conservative fundraisers and say, we're on the same side together. Oh, no. And that's something we have to keep in mind in terms of how fast we can get long overdue change in this country. And that includes, by the way, the bloated military budget, criminal wars of aggression abroad, being the policeman for the world and only making it worse, creating more enemies. We're ingenious in Washington at creating more hatred in other countries against us. What started out as a criminal gang in northeast Afghanistan attacking on 9/11 has now gone into 25 countries with all kinds of sub-chapters of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth. That's what we've gotten for $3 trillion of your money, dead U.S. soldiers, traumatized U.S. soldiers, over 1 million dead Iraqis, millions sick and injured, spilling over into other countries like Syria and Somalia and so forth. So we have to get serious. There's always a time for fun, but if we're not a serious society to a critical mass of time, we are going to be a deteriorating society. We're going to be controlled by our own low expectation levels. We're going to be controlled by money and politics, nullifying our votes. We're going to be controlled by shutting us out of the property we own, like the public lands and the public airways. We own the public airways. We own the public lands. But corporations control them and turn it against us. And as a result, we grow up corporate. In fact, if there's anybody here who hasn't grown up corporate, they're either from Finland or Mars. Because we all grow up looking at all those TV ads and so on that describe the economy, the food, the autos, the insurance policies, the banks, the way the corporations want us to see it. When I was growing up in Connecticut, I saw my share of automobile ads on TV, and they were only the ads showing style and horsepower and glamour and psychosexual appeals. There weren't ads talking about fuel efficiency, safety, pollution control, ease of maintenance and repair. Forget it. I never saw an ad for mass transit. I never saw people in a nice mass transit car reading the paper, snoozing on their way to work, parallel to a clogged LA highway where everybody's shouting rage at each other, right? You never see that, right? Well, no wonder there's not that much support for mass transit going back years. Just let me give two illustrations of where citizens were active in California and where citizens were not organized in California. The first was 1988, when I was asked to come to California because auto insurance rates were going through the sky. And there was no reason for it other than they got away with it. We had a weak state insurance regulator in Sacramento. And so we started a campaign with Harvey Rosenfield and others. We weren't more than half a dozen people. And we informed the LA Times and others what we were doing, went all the way up and down the state, and qualified an initiative to regulate auto insurance prices. Because at that time, there was no regulation of auto insurance prices in California. The industry got wind of this. They couldn't stop us from putting it on the ballot, but they spent $70 million to beat us, except we beat them. And in 1988 to now, according to the actuary, J. Robert Hunter, very respected man, this has saved California consumers $100 billion. And California went from one of the highest auto insurance prices in the country to one of the lowest. That's because a handful of people with the facts, communicating, and reflecting the majority opinion of motorists. They even got a rebate. Now go back earlier in the 1930s and 1940s when the trolley industry was the last remaining competitor to the auto companies. They wanted to sell more cars. People use trolleys, they don't buy cars. Los Angeles had the largest electrified trolley system in the world. Whole arc around LA. They used to call it the red car. And they got together, GM got together with an oil company and a tire company, They all wanted to sell their products. And they bought up the LA trolley system and tore out the tracks. They closed it down. So they could build more highways and more cars, tires, and burn more gasoline. They did this in 25 other cities all over the country. The Justice Department prosecuted them for violating the antitrust laws, and they convicted them, including GM, in federal district court in Chicago in 1948. And the fine of what some call the economic crime of the century, because you are paying for it right now in congested highways, they fined General Motors $5,000. That's it. Corporate crime pays. And people are suffering from that all over the country. An imbalanced surface transportation system, heavily on highways, and fits and little spurts of public transit here and there, hardly reflecting modern public transit technology, to say the least. There were no organized opposition to that. And they rolled the politician, and they got away with it. So it starts with our expectation level. Does it surprise you to learn that the American people have the lowest expectation level of the kind of country that they live in, of any people in the Western world? Tell me to prove it. Okay, here we go. We all study Eugene Debs. How many people know Eugene Debs, right? The great labor leader in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was so popular that when he took a train from Philadelphia to Chicago once to speak to an open-air rally, and 150,000 people showed up. This was no smartphone text messages, period. People showed up. At the end of his career, he ran for president 4 or 5 times. I synchronized with him. And he opposed World War I, just freedom of speech. And Woodrow Wilson had him prosecuted and put in jail, and he got 1 million votes for president while he was in jail. At the end of his career, 1920s, a reporter came up to him and said, "Mr. Debs, what's your greatest regret?" And Debs looked at the reporter and said, "My greatest regret?" He said, "My greatest regret is that the American people, under their Constitution, can have almost anything they want, but it seems like they don't want much of anything at all." Wow. You think that's no longer the case? Watch. Western Europe, 1945. Devastated. End of World War II. Huge unemployment. Crushed cities. Abandoned countrysides. You can imagine what it was like. Out of those ashes, with a multi-party system in these countries, not two parties, with strong labor unions, strong consumer co-ops, like food co-ops, they established the following services paid for by the taxpayers. In other words, they got something for their taxes. Tuition-free higher education. No such thing as student debt. Full universal health insurance from cradle to grave. Paid maternity leave. Paid child care. Paid family sick leave, sometimes for a year. They got decent public transit, inexpensive. They got well-kept parks. They got support for the arts. They had a higher minimum wage. They had pensions. They had paid vacations, 4 to 7 weeks now. That's for everybody, not just people who belong to labor unions. We don't have any of that today for everyone. See the difference in expectation levels? We got the commie scare. We put our billions of dollars in massive redundant weapon systems vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. That's where a lot of our money went to. And of course, there is no end to how many submarines and bombers. You ask these manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, how many F-35s? They never tell you how many, because enough is never enough. How many nuclear subs? Do you know how much explosive power a Trident nuclear submarine has? With multiple nuclear warheads? This is just one sub. Let's say it unloaded. How many cities do you think it could destroy in an hour around the world? Anybody want to start? Huh? 10? 200. One sub. How many do you need? But it's big business. It's profit. It's what President Eisenhower condemned in his farewell speech, which you can see on the internet, in January 1961, when he warned us about the military-industrial complex not only squeezing our freedom, but damaging our economy. For all this weaponry, we don't build the schools we need, the clinics we need, the libraries we want to maintain, the public transit, the up-to-date sewage and water systems. And so, look at the expectation level in Western Europe. Even in Canada, they have full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor and hospital. I have a lot of cousins up there, so I know the land up there. And they do it on half of the price. That is, they pay $4,500 per capita, covering everybody. We're up to $9,500 per capita, and we don't cover tens of millions of people, even under Obamacare. Or they're undercovered. What's our excuse? Our excuse is that we go through schools learning corporate propaganda, learning about free markets, which don't exist, because corporate welfare destroys free market. Bailouts, handouts, subsidies, giveaways. You can't have free markets. When big business, when they get in trouble, they're supposed to go bankrupt and obey the market. No, they go to Washington for a bailout, like Wall Street. We grow up believing that it's all up to us, we got to sink or swim, and our income comes from salary and wages. It doesn't come from public services sufficiently. We don't demand paid maternity leave, paid sick leave, so on. You have people working for federal agencies in Washington, no paid maternity leave. They have to pay $15,000 to take care of the infant a year. That's the federal government. So you have to raise expectation levels. Facts are a good way to raise expectation levels. I spoke over a year ago at Harvard Law School. The first thing I said to these ex-valedictorians was that they were factually unprepared for law school. And I said, you want to test me? Tell me 6 corporate crimes. Corporate crimes are reported, even in the Wall Street Journal. They have no clue how corporations control us, how they strategically plan our tax system. They plan our commercializing childhood. They plan our elections, our government, our foreign and military policy. They're planning our genetic inheritance, Monsanto, patenting gene sequences, for example. They've been planning the kind of food that our children eat to get fat and be predisposed to diabetes and high blood pressure, junk food, junk drink. They're planning how much they're going to dump in our environment in terms of toxics. They're planning and planning and planning. That's what they do for a living. That's in their DNA. So if they're planning our future, they want to privatize our public schools. When are we going to plan our own future? I'm not talking about small business here. I'm talking about the big global corporations who have no allegiance to country or community other than control them or abandon them to dictators abroad who hire workers at 80 cents an hour with modern capital equipment. So excuse me to have a little test here. Let's have a little fun. If someone said to you, write down everything you own, and you got 15 minutes. And so, okay, you play along with the game. You start writing, own clothes, own a car, own books, own a computer, MP player, furniture, whatever. And the person says, keep going, and you're down to paper clips, right? And you can't think of anything more. You say, oh yeah, I have a savings account. Okay, good, put that down. How long would it be before you put down, I'm part owner of 1/3 of America, which is public lands. I'm part owner of the public airwaves, which the people own and the broadcast companies control free of charge, compliments of an indentured Congress. And they decide who says what 24 hours a day. And who doesn't say what 24 hours a day. And they're using our property. We're the landlords, they're the tenant, they pay us no rent, and they shut us out with the kind of nonsense and fluff and disgusting low-grade entertainment that they fill the airwaves with. Have you ever watched Saturday afternoon, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox? Hold on to your stomach. It's grade B movie reruns. It's competition, people flipping over in bicycles and pits. It's infomercials. And I watch it. Once in a while, I turn it on, see what they're doing with our property. And I end up saying with the same conclusion. I say, is that all that's going on in America? Is the only thing going on television, on universities and colleges, sports? Is that what people go to school for, sports? In Western Europe, they have sport leagues. They don't have University of Heidelberg football team or soccer team. They're separate. And I'm saying to myself, hey, this is our property. Do you ever study the commons? The commons are like the public lands, the public airways. When you see these CEOs bragging about Silicon Valley and all the wonderful things they've done, you know what they don't tell you? They wouldn't even be there without the U.S. taxpayer and research and development from NASA and the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Agriculture that did the basic research that created the internet and that still creates the kind of technology that they then apply and market. But they don't tell you, do they? That without you, the taxpayer, you wouldn't recognize the aerospace industry, the semiconductor industry, the biotech industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the nanotechnology industry, the containerization industry. That came from U.S. naval research. One day I sent a letter to major CEOs, and I said, why don't you have a taxpayer appreciation day? We say, thank you, U.S. taxpayer, on April 15th. That's a good day. They weren't amused. And you have all these stadiums built with tax money, all these ballparks, right? They never named them taxpayer stadium, taxpayer ballpark. No, they named them, Wells Fargo Stadium or some other corporate crook because they pay for the naming rights. But the naming rights are nothing compared to how much the taxpayer paid to build the stadiums. And unlike the Roman Colosseum, where they let in the people free at least, they charge you through the nose for these. What a Frankfurter costs, parking, tickets. You see, this is all because we have low expectation levels. It's back to Eugene Debs. So, first recognition, we don't grow up civic. We don't learn civic skills in school. We don't have civic experience connecting school with community. There are always exceptions, to be sure, and they basically show how important it is, how the students love it and the teachers love it when they connect like that. When fifth grader came to a school in Utah back 20-some years ago. She was very excited. She walked into class and said, "I've just discovered a waste dump." The teacher and students said, "What? Where?" She said, "Just 4 blocks away." And they said, "It's impossible. We walked by there." She said, "You wait and see." And so they went down, and it was a waste dump covered with shrubbery. And so the teacher was so impressed by the students, she starts a little class. And to make a long story short, they got it cleaned up. The mayor cleaned it up. They became little celebrities. They actually were asked to testify on the Superfund. 5th graders. So the teacher gets more excited. She writes a book called Kids in Social Action. And that's what she does now. She goes around the country trying to get schools and communities to connect on real issues. Now, would it surprise you to ask you the following question? When I say the following words, think what image comes to your mind. Here we go. Very quick. Crime, violence, regulation, welfare, crime, violence, regulation, welfare. Street crime, burglaries, assault, rapes, government regulation, and welfare handed out to poor people. All accurate. But quantitatively, far less than corporate violence, corporate crime, corporate welfare with your taxes, and corporate regulation of your lives. How come? And by the way, anybody who you hear makes a factual assertion, always ask what their source is. When anybody in government says, oh, they're going to send drones here, or they're going to send money there, ask them what the legal authority is under federal law or our Constitution. If reporters just ask, what's the evidence and where's your legal authority in Washington, we might have a better government. Okay, so corporate crime. All you got to do is subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. It's crime against consumers like Wells Fargo, you know that story. The whole mortgage racket in 2007, 2008, where they had robo-signatures and all kinds of deceptive practices. You have corporate crime against workers, occupational diseases, for example, not paying on time, or not paying what they should be paying. You have crime against pensions, looting them in terms of speculation on Wall Street. Corporate crime is everywhere, and you can just look it up on the internet. Corporate violence. Okay, about 14,000 homicides a year in the U.S. Now make the following comparison. And the issue is preventiveness. Because some crimes are deliberate, some crimes are negligent, some crimes are for profit, some crimes have different motivations. But let's have the yardstick be, we would like to prevent them all. All right, the violence. Ready? How many were killed on September 11th, 2001? Anybody know? Remember? That's right, just under 3,000. Okay? That's once, fortunately. Just once. Okay. According to OSHA, 1,100 die every week in this country from workplace-related diseases and traumas, like collapse of construction sites, etc. 1,100. According to the EPA, over 1,200 people die from air pollution diseases every week. By the way, 1.1 million die from air pollution in India alone a year. Okay? Let's try this one. 800 people a week die in this country because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. It's 800 a week. Try this one. 5,000 people in this country die every week in hospitals due to hospital malpractice, hospital mishaps, hospital-induced infection, and misprescribing of pharmaceuticals. 5,000 a week, 250,000 a year. Source, Johns Hopkins University Medical School, March 2016, peer-reviewed study. That was the rock bottom estimate. They think it's higher. And it doesn't include clinics, just hospitals. Are you getting the idea that styles of violence are prosecuted based on the power of the perpetrator? The more powerful the perpetrators, the more they get off. The less popular the perpetrators, the more they get the hammer blow of the police. 250,000 people a year? It isn't even an item in the election? 250,000 people a year, preventable? It isn't even discussed in the press, the one-day story when it came out? 250,000 people subjected to the silent cumulative form of violence? And it doesn't even get us angry compared to somebody who's assaulted in a back alley? One person? Too many? That's how we grow up corporate. How about preventable deaths and auto crashes? When I started going after GM and the auto companies, because I'd lost a lot of classmates in high school and college to crashes, and I learned that they could have been saved by seatbelts, airbags, padded dash panels, stronger door latches, etc., better brakes, better tires. 5 times the number of people your age were being killed per 100 million vehicle miles. So 1/5 of the fatality now. That's how improved motor vehicles are, highways, etc. But there's still people killed, ignition switch defective GM covered up for years. Still people killed or sickened by Toyota sudden acceleration or nitrogen oxides release, especially here in California due to the cheating on the software by VW. Deliberate, premeditated crime. All these are recent. Let's go to corporate welfare. You want to compare poverty welfare with corporate? Trillions of dollars we had to spend directly and indirectly to bail out Wall Street. Half of what Washington does is it's shoveling out subsidies, handouts, quotas, inflated contracts to corporations. That's what they do in Washington. It's your money. Corporate welfare. The conservatives call it crony capitalism. Same thing. There's a big conservative liberal convergence. If they would organize more than just talk about it, they could change it. It's an unstoppable political force. All right, now we get to regulation. This is fun. You think of government when you think of regulation. That's true. But a lot of regulation, is lobbied through by corporations to regulate us. Like we have to pay our taxes, but they get away not paying their taxes. And so they push through regulations to favor their bottom line, to favor their profits, including corporate welfare. Now here's how corporations regulate us. How many of you have signed fine print contracts in your life? Nobody has not, right? Okay, it's sign on a dotted line or click on, right? How many of you have ever read these fine print contracts? Once? Okay. You know why most people don't read them, other than they're microscopic? It's because it doesn't matter. If they see things they don't like, too bad. If you don't like State Farm's policy, go to Allstate. No kidding, it's the same fine print. You don't like GM? Go to Ford. No kidding, it's the same installment loan fine print. Now, the 2 great freedoms in our country, which we inherited from medieval England, was freedom of contract, no more serfs with vassals and lords, freedom of contract, and the freedom to sue for wrongful injury. Somebody hurt you, you can sue them. Some company sold you a dangerous product, you could sue them. The corporations, strategically planning our legal system, have now reached a point where they have persuaded too many judges that you have agreed to all this fine print. You have agreed to them saying, if you have a complaint, you can't go to court, you got to go to compulsory arbitration. Really? You have agreed that the company can change the contract unilaterally without even telling you. Really? That isn't even a contract, right? It's supposed to be a meeting of the minds. How many of you have had to pay for a bounced check? What do you pay in California? 30? 35? Okay. Did you agree to that? Did you agree to all those late penalty charges? Did you agree to all the 350 different charges banks hit you with? Of course not. Oh, yes, you did. It's in the fine print. That's how they regulate you. That fine print is the way they regulate and shove the responsibilities onto you and escape from responsibility to you by the vendors. That's corporate regulation. Okay, so we grow up corporate, all right? So I don't want you to get embarrassed with this question, but how many of you have never been to McDonald's? That makes you and me. Are you from Finland? Okay, he went in Moscow, but as a tourist. Okay, how many of you have never been to a Walmart? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many of you have never been to a Starbucks? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Good, we ought to form a club. Why haven't I been to these? So I will not be a patron of these giant corporations who always want to escape their taxes when you've got small family business that can do a good job in the community. That's what I want to support. Besides, I didn't want to grow fat on triple cheeseburgers slithering down my throat. I don't particularly like Walmart, the way they treat workers. They're paying 1 million workers less today in inflation-adjusted income than Walmart workers were paid in 1968. They would now be paid $11.25, and they finally got up to about $10 now for Walmart. I don't like the way they hollow out small business in Main Street. It's a core of the community. I don't like the way they shut down and abandon after they've gotten tax abatements. I don't like the way they have suppliers overseas who pay their workers slave wages. I don't like the way they tell suppliers here if they want to sell to Walmart, they better go to China and meet what they call the China price. That's for starters. I don't like the idea that the head of Walmart makes $12,000 an hour plus benefits. An hour! Have that sink in. Before martini time lunch on January 2, that man has paid himself more than the entire full-time worker does for the entire year. If we don't have an indignation level, we'll never change anything. I'm not talking about flailing out in rage. I'm talking about connecting what we know in our heads with fire in our belly for change. I never liked bullies since I was 4 years old. I didn't like sixth graders beating up fourth graders. Sometimes I paid the price and interfering. So here we go. How can Laverne College be a powerful force in democracy? It's so easy, it's embarrassing. What you do is you connect the school with the community. I'm sure you have already different connections, obviously, volunteers and so on. But here's what I'm talking about. When I took chemistry, biology in high school, We did not test soils in our community. We did not test the local drinking water. Why not? We would have been more interested in chemistry and biology if we tested soils for contamination or if we tested drinking water for toxics. We never did it. So I hardly remember anything I learned in biology and chemistry class. Went through one year after another. Now suppose colleges around the country tested local drinking water. You think Flint, Michigan and the lead disaster would have happened? Of course not. They'd have caught it right at the beginning when they switched from the Detroit River to the Flint River without telling the people. And they poisoned all these kids. Soil erosion and soil contamination, very serious problem in this country. A lot of times you go to California farm country and you're on a little road, and when they had lead-based gasoline, tetraethyl lead, you had all the crops right next to it ingesting that lead. And of course, you know, that's silent violence. You know, lead in your food doesn't sting you, but it's harmful. That's the kind of thing schools can do all over the country. How does Laverne College become powerful in Congress? Easier than you think. You have government classes. You have one called Congress 101. What does Congress 101 do? You study Congress through the lens of the two senators and representatives. You break up the class with all different parts of a senator and member of Congress' career. Some do the voting. Some do the behavior at hearings. Some of the students do the campaign contributions. Some of them do constituent service. Some of them do the level of bullshit coming out of their mouths. Okay? Some of them do how they connect with each other. Do they mobilize each other for the right things? Or they just follow the leader and blindly do what the political leader or the delegation chief of the state tells them to do? How do they connect with the federal agencies? How do they handle letters and requests from constituents back home? What do they do with their vacations? Are they abandoning town meetings with telephone meetings because they don't want the seats full of protesting citizens? It's a lot of fun, isn't it? It's a lot of fun. And you put out a report every year or every semester. You know what happens? You become the most important people in California for those politicians in Washington. Knowledge, building, democratic power. You also learn a lot more about Congress. You also learn how to interview staff and members of Congress, none of whom will say no to you because they know that you are the pipeline of information about how they behave and misbehave to thousands of voters back home. Just an example. So there's a lot harder things you're going to do in life than be an active citizen for 200 to 300, 400 hours a year on the injustice of your choice, connecting in the neighborhood, the community, state, nation, and the world. What are the harder things you're going to do in life? Try raising children. Try caring for an ailing grandparent when you have no home health care. Try overcoming accidents. Try having 2 jobs at low income and you're paying $1,000 a month daycare and commuting 2 hours a day. Being an active citizen improves your private life. It improves your private livelihood. It gives you bigger meaning. It gives you a higher estimate of your own significance. When I came to California years ago and helped start the California Public Interest Research Group, CalPIRG, anybody hear of CalPIRG? They've done a lot of good things. The students assess themselves $6, $7, $8 a year. They have a nonprofit group. They elect a board of directors. They hire activists in their 20s and 30s, lawyers, community advocates, sometimes scientists, and they lobby. They set up initiatives. They win. And that's the kind of work you should get course credit for. And in some states with these public interest research groups, the faculty do give course credit in places like New York State. In fact, a young woman went to Albany on semester from SUNY Binghamton, and she lobbied through a hearing aid bill for the elderly who were being ripped off, and she got a semester credit for it. How's that for learning by doing? Marcus Cicero once said, the ancient Roman lawyer, freedom is participation in power. And a 14th century Chinese philosopher put it in another way. He said, to know and not to do is not to know. Look at the tens of thousands of professors all over the country. We're in a crisis now politically. Are they going to mobilize, or are they going to stick to their routines? If they stick to their routines, 100,000 faculty have less power than one corporate lobbyist in Washington. If they break out and they become greater than the sum of their parts, a lot of change can come together with the students who work with them. So I've been very gratified, the students who are protesting. The mother of all assent in our history is dissent. Almost everything we've agreed upon in this country, including free speech and protection against search and seizure illegally and so on, all started out with dissenters, and it became assent. Dissent is the mother of assent. And so that's what it is before you, and always ask yourself, are you doing the same thing every weekend or every evening, or are you breaking your routine so that you can have a higher estimate of your own impact as citizens and help change the world for the better? That's what we want to look back on 20,000 days from now. You want to look back and ask yourself, what did you miss that you didn't have to miss? What movement of justice could you have been a part of that would have given you unquantifiable gratification? I want to end on this note. Change is a lot easier than we think. There are 535 members of Congress. They put their shoes on every day like you and I. We know their names. They have enormous authority. We leave them alone. We give them the power we have, and they turn it against us so often on behalf of a handful of big corporations. We shouldn't leave them alone. We should recover that power and summon them to our town meetings and our agendas and our future, and then send them back to Washington with our instructions, especially on issues backed by conservative and liberals alike. Someday, some of you will form these Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district. And someday, there'll be a Nobel Prize for people who are innovative champions in practicing democracy. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph Nader, very much. Folks, we know students, some got to cut out for class, but it's our tradition at University of Laverne. Students get the first question. So, sure, here we go.
In 1965, you published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed.
Yes.
Attacking the car manufacturers for ignoring safety precautions for profit, basically. What is some advice you for a young politician? What's something that many of my young students here, what's something that they can go into? What's another issue that they can attack in that manner? Basically like you did when you were our age.
Yeah, what advice I give students today? Yeah, well, one is if you don't have it already, start a civic skill course here, where you learn how to use the Information Act, how to form coalitions, how to resist being discouraged, how to give credit to others, how to develop strategies and tactics. It's essential. Practicing democracy is the most important thing you can get out of college in addition to a skill, whether as an accountant or an engineer or what have you, nurse. And I found where schools have done this, students love it. So you learn how to be a skilled citizen. You pick a problem you want to attack or go after, or a solution you want to further, and you learn by doing. You know the old phrase of John Dewey, you learn by doing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. The other is open a chapter of CalPERG. If you don't have a chapter of CalPERG, they're at various Cal systems, UCal systems, Berkeley and Santa Cruz. Just call them up and they'll come and speak to a gathering of students and faculty, and that'll give you an extracurricular opportunity to connect with students all over the state. Remember, students changed the country back in the 60s on environment, against the Vietnam War, on women's rights, on student rights. You're no different. They're no different than you. They just had higher expectation levels.
And lower debt.
Sorry. I'm an assistant professor in the biology department, and I think something, especially with the feel of the political environment at the moment, I think people aren't connecting with scientists, and they think we're really strange, and they kind of approach us. And you just mentioned that a lot of the work that has moved technology forward in this country is based off of taxpayers' money. So I feel like I'm a public servant to people in the United States. How do we get that message across? And I don't think it's just for science, I think it's other disciplines as well, but how do we get people to connect with us, people who are serving them, and not think that we're against them, so that they can connect?
Believe me, I tried to organize faculty around the country. I failed miserably. So I can't answer your question. They're going to have to organize themselves. In the internet age, you know, in the old days you had to worry about long distance calls, pricing, and postage stamps. You don't have to worry about that anymore. It better come fast, because they're going to go after Pell Grants. They're going to go after all kinds of aids, special education. This is a total mad dog regime that's setting up in Washington. It's by far the worst in modern American history. It's a bunch of, and you can thank the Electoral College, among other things, you know. What country you lose the popular vote and you win the presidency? That's really smart. Our founding fathers weren't completely smart. That was a serious mistake, even for their own rationale. But you have militarists, corporatists, and racists coming into Washington. Now the civil servants are going to fight it. You wait and see. They're already fighting it. But will the universities fight it? Will the colleges fight it? Already people are in the streets protesting. It's very marvelous. It's all spontaneous, you know. There's no big funder of something like this, which makes it more exciting and real. But this is a showdown for American democracy. It's a classic historic collision. No more pretense, no more camouflage. Big business has taken over the departments and agencies in Washington like never before. It's not like they weren't without influence. So this is a struggle. I'll put my bet on the American people. I think they're coming to Washington, these corporatists, militarists, and racists. I think they're drunk with their own power. They want to make change fast. They're going to trip up. They're going to get in trouble already. They're going to get in trouble. And we've got to accelerate that and basically come out of it stronger as a democratic society, with high expectation levels and with a resolve to put muscle in that phrase, a government of, by, and for the people.
Thank you, Ralph.
I think that one of the fundamental problems with getting change nowadays is that our one check against those who are in power has historically been the democratic process. But especially in recent decades, we've seen that process be eroded in several ways so that people don't have as much access to democracy and to the checks on those who are in power. the Electoral College is one very small piece of the pie, but in so much as international organizations have downgraded us to a less than perfect functioning democracy, how do we then use that democratic process to restore the democratic process?
Well, one is, look at the Electoral College. A philanthropist in San Francisco, Steve Silberstein, he made a modest fortune in a software company. He sold it, set up a foundation, hired 6 people, and they go all over the country getting states to pass laws and say that, it's called an interstate compact, that they will give their Electoral College votes in future presidential elections to whoever wins the national popular vote. California's passed the law, New York, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts. They're already up to 165 electoral votes, and as you know, 270, and it's over. 6 people, a philanthropist. You do it by organizing highly focused campaigns. This book is full of examples of how people drove their own democratic process and got things changed. More nutrition in school lunch programs, for getting hazardous drugs off the marketplace, medicines, so on. This is the book that I'm going to sign. I figured there's 140 characters in tweet, so I got 140 pages here. I respect short attention span, but it's loaded. It's loaded with examples of regular people taking democratic processes that are little used and refurbishing them, like the initiative, referendum, recall, like freedom of information requests, and then publicizing all the dirty meat and poultry plants there are in a certain area. Department of Agriculture reports that weren't made public, but got to be made public. Filing a lawsuit that overturned all kinds of bad things. Running for local election and taking over local government or local board of education. There are far more opportunities to fine-tune our democratic processes than we take advantage of. And of course, there are all kinds of exciting new democratic processes that we're not working to install, like public funding of public campaigns, like having our own radio and TV stations using our own property, the public airways. So we don't have to beg the local commercial TV station to cover something that they should have been covering as a matter of newsworthiness in the community. And the nice thing about this book is that it switches the dynamic between you and your senators and representatives. Right now, the members of Congress, most of them have safe districts. They're gerrymandered districts, either Republican, Democrat. They know the media. They don't get hassled or exposed. It's a very comfortable re-election process. They flatter the people back home. They send little cards when the youngsters graduate from high school. They go to clam bakes. They flatter, fool, flummox the people. And so this has what's called the summons, where we, the people, send a written summons to the senators and representatives saying, you are hereby summoned to a town meeting that we have arranged at a place that we have secured on X date. And we will present our demands to you and our instructions, and we have left-right support, and you're going back to Washington and do what we say. And so this is a formal summons, whereas, like that, now, therefore, and it switches the dynamic completely. You have, never takes more than 1% of the people to make major changes, no matter how powerful the bureaucracy and the corporations are. If they represent majority opinion back home, it never takes more than 1% or less. Now, 1% of the adults in this country in congressional districts is What do you think it is? You have 225 million adults. So you take 1%, it's 2.5 million. You take 1/10 of 1%, it's 250,000. You don't need much more than that. Organized with a couple full-time staff in every congressional district. I'm telling you, we've done it with far less. Because we know the people passively out there are behind us, the polls say they're behind us, and believe it or not, the politicians still are afraid of the people.
Thank you. Another question. A couple more questions we have time for.
Yes, I wanted to first say that, I agree 100% with what, you've said thus far, and also you mentioned something about sports. And this to me was very interesting with the Super Bowl. I mean, I've never watched a Super Bowl in my life before until this one that just passed. And I thought it was really interesting how we have millions of America watching this game, but yet nobody shows up or in those amounts, massive amounts to our elections, town hall meetings, city hall meetings, and so to me, I think it's an outrage. And you just mentioned that we pay for these like Staples Center and now they get the naming rights. I mean, that is preposterous. I just can't believe that, like you mentioned, that we're just sitting back and taking it in. That is an outrage. Like as a U.S. citizen, we should be, as you mentioned, taking a vote, taking a stand. As your book mentions, that we are, the 1%. We should be out there making our voice heard. And I appreciate your comments on how we can mobilize and how we can do things. And like you said, the summits part, it's wonderful to hear, these ideas, such as, what you're mentioning. And I thank you so much for being here and opening our eyes, to how we can actually make a movement going and, just, speaking on our behalf, on our consumers' behalf, and what you've done thus far. I think it's great, and I just really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a $2 bill. This is a picture of the ones who showed up July 4th, 1776, signed the Declaration of Independence. They're all white males, okay. Some were slave owners, but they thought they were signing their death warrant for King George III, most powerful army in the world at the time. So we have this in my hometown on the storefront, and it's expanded. And underneath said, "Aren't you glad these people showed up? Isn't it time you showed up?" Showing up is half of the battle. You fill a town meeting of a senator, I mean, they're lucky to get out the back door. Look, it's happening now, isn't it? They don't know what to do with it. And what they do is they say, if 500 people show up, that means 50,000 people must have the same feeling. So we have to relearn what it is to practice civics, to stop growing up corporate, and to basically utilize the tools we have for democracy and strengthen them because we use them. My father once told us, you don't use your rights, you're going to lose your rights. Like the right to have your day in court is being restricted and restricted and restricted because we're not using the courts enough. In 1774, Massachusetts, the farmers used the courts so much that when King George put the Tories in charge of the courts, they boycotted the courts and brought the Tories to their knees. So it's very important just to have enough confidence in yourself not to say, well, what am I? I'm just one person, que sera, sera. No. You drop out from democracy. You're a quitter. We have to hold ourselves mutually to higher standards. And we have a wonderful country. We can improve these things tremendously. Anxiety level goes down. Look at all the paperwork and health care, and you get denied, and you get excluded, and the deductible, and the copay, and then you can't understand the bills, and they're all inscrutable. Who needs to live this way? We can change it like that. Less than 1% of the people.
The other 1%. We're going to have one more question in the back.
So I'm a full-time student. I'm also a mother of a child with disabilities. My biggest question for you is, what do we do to ensure children with disabilities under the Federal Act idea continue to get the support they need to have an education so that they're able to commute and provide for themselves within their futures?
You go to a group in San Diego called Children's Advocacy Center, and it's at the University of San Diego Law School, and it's the leading child's advocate group in California. They've gotten more bills through Sacramento than any other group. It's run by a genius, incredibly smart and productive law professor, Robert Fellmuth, F-E-L-L-M-E-T-H. Just tell him that I called and put the question to them. They put out a children's budget. They analyze all the state budgets that deal with children, including children with disability, and by all means, utilize them. That's what they're there for.
Okay, Ralph. Thank you, Ralph Nader. Ralph, on behalf of the University of La Verne, I'm authorized to gift you with, this is our 125th anniversary. There's a book there that commemorates that. And I think some bling of some kind or another that we hope you wear at your next occasion. So,
Okay, thank you.
Ralph Nader.
Yeah, 1891. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Folks, there's going to be a book signing and reception out front. Please exit through the back, come to Fosnot Court that way, back here, and then come around and down. We'll be there in just a few minutes.
By the way, if you'd like my column free every week, 7 minutes of agitation, just go to nader.org and sign up, and you'll get it automatically every week. If you like what you heard, you'd want to hear more, by all means. Thank you.